morning. On behalf of Square Mile and ESG Clarity, a warm welcome to ESG Pathway. We have a fabulous event for you today. The event has been put together by Square Mile and ESG Clarity and are designed to be informative and provide practical guidance. This is the first event in a series of 4, offering assistance in navigating your way through the fog, the jargon, the changing customer requirements, the plethora of new fund launches, the regulation that seems to be ever changing, and all these are plaguing what could be one of the most important events in our industry in terms of how we can do good, avoid harm, and lead change. And the purpose of today is to provide you with clear guidance and ESG pathway to the success for you and your business. To do this, we will be drawing on the experience of your fellow advisors, the leading platforms in the UK, the Investment Association, a specialist law firm to provide some thoughts on the impending regulations, 12 leading asset managers in this space, and of course, your good selves. I'm looking for you to submit questions and feedback to ensure we provide you with the answers to the questions you need. My name is Steve Kenny, and as I've said, it's my pleasure to introduce today's event. I have 4 points to cover. I'm going to provide you with an overview of the agenda, talk through the housekeeping, explain to you your part in today's event, and last but by no means least, a thank you. Firstly, today's agenda, 5 distinct sessions. The advisor's experience. My colleague, Jake Merler, will chair a panel with 3 superb advisors who will share their practical experience. How have they and their firms dealt with this challenge? That will be followed by videos. Ask the expert. 3 advisors have submitted video questions that will be answered by the experts from AXA Investment, Aegon Asset Management, and BNY Mellon. That will then be platforms cope with the ESG challenge. Following that will be a panel chaired by Richard Romalee, MD from Square Mile, with 3 asset managers, Federated Hermes, Jupiter, and Elgin, answering the question, ESG, what is it, and what are they as asset managers doing? The final session today will come from Natalie Kenway, editor of ESG Clarity, who will provide a quick roundup of some of the key points from today. On to the housekeeping. The event today is being recorded. You will all be on mute. Questions and feedback will be via the side of your screen. And the good news is the event does qualify for CPD, as well as providing that practical assistance I talked about. Your part in today's event session, please submit that via the side of your screen. And we will be running 5 polls today, simple questions to gain your feedback and a sense of your perspective on this subject. We would be grateful if you would complete the questionnaire that will be sent to you in the follow-up email. The first, to test the system is working. I want to run a quick poll. And the question is, will it rain today? Now, that's not as obvious as you would think. October is the wettest month in the year, and September has been particularly dry. So if we could quickly run today's first poll just to test that you are the experienced virtual conference attendees I think you are. So will it rain today? A, yes, B, no. And if you could just vote now, we'll see how we go. And for those of you in the southeast, you'll see that it is a beautiful sunny day, but that is no guarantee given its English weather. Do take the opportunity to vote just to make sure that we know this is working. As with all these things, technology is always a challenge when we start an event. Hopefully the result will flash up in a minute. I can sense your excitement to get into the main event, but we just want to check the polling is working. As we go through, I'm sure it will get slicker and better. Whilst we're waiting for the result, I would like to thank the sponsors, the 12 sponsors. Oh, the poll is working, and I'm delighted to say that, like myself, you are sceptical of the British weather, and 73% of you think it is going to rain today, and there's no surprise there. So, before I pass over to Jake, I would like to say a couple of quick thanks. Firstly, to our 12 sponsors, 6 of which you'll be hearing from today in one way or another. Aegon Asset Management, AXA IM, BNY Mellon, Federated Hermes, Jupiter and Elgin. The other 6 who you'll be hearing from in the coming weeks are 7IM, Aberdeen Standard, Invesco, Janus Henderson, JP Morgan and Schroders. On behalf of myself and ESG Clarity, many thanks to these sponsors. Without their support, this event would not be possible. And without further ado from myself, I will now pass on to my colleague Jake, who will introduce his panel, The Advisor Experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I'm Jake Moeller, Senior Investment Consultant at Square Mile. It's great to be here. I have 3 fantastic advisors. We've already done a trial, and the conversation is going to be very interesting this morning. I hope you're looking forward to it, as I am. If I may introduce Annette Hender, who's a partner at TaylorMade, George Critchley, who's the Senior Partner at Pennine Wealth Solutions, and Declan McAndrew, Head of Investment Research at Foster de Novo. First question to each of you. George, if I could get you to start. The ESG pathway, and I think the pathway is quite an apt description, because responsible investing for many advisors is a journey. Could each of you please outline a little bit about your firm, the type of firm it is, the type of clients, why you undertook the journey, and where you think you are currently in the journey? George, if I could get you to start with that, please.
Okay, good morning, Jake. Good morning, everybody. I run a DFM firm called Pennine Wealth Solutions, as Jake has mentioned, but I'm also chairman of an IFA firm called True Bearing Chartered Financial Planners. So I've got to put that out straight away. The 2 firms run completely separately. So the journey really started just on an ad hoc basis many years ago, with use of something like the Friends Provident Stewardship funds that were available back in the 90s. But the real journey started around about 2015. We'd thought for a couple of years that we wanted to get involved in this area of the market. We thought we were late to the market, and in reality we were probably a couple of years early. But we wanted to really understand the ESG impact environment, and a contact of ours, John Fleetwood, helped us greatly getting going. So we've done a lot of work, Jake. We've been training advisors, we've been developing seminars for clients, we've created new websites and things. And at this stage, we've got about 30 advisors that are very active in the ESG investing market. And we're probably somewhere round about just north of 20 million, I think, invested in this way, which for us, we think is just scratching the surface, to be honest. We can see over the next 2-3 years that will certainly go over the 100 million mark. And the latest experiences during the coronavirus lockdown have only accelerated the thing anyway.
Annette, slightly smaller firm. What's your experience and rationale and motivation for starting this journey?
Good morning, Jake, and good morning, everybody. Very much a smaller firm, 6 advisors. We've been operating for just under 10 years now. From our perspective, this is an area we've been really excited about for a number of years, but never really managed to make the traction that I would have liked to have seen in a business. And I've been trying to assess why that is, because the levels of enthusiasm are there. We think our clients are interested, and there's just been a real lack of clarity, lots of different types of terminology in the industry. And we've found it very difficult to feel that we can be authentic and deliver genuine solutions to our clients. So we've taken a step back from this and looked at how we can put a much more systematic and robust approach to this in place, and very much started at the top of the business and working down. Responsibility and sustainability issues are something that's really consistent with our culture. It's something that we feel runs through the blood of our business. So it's just now looking at how we can integrate that into the services that we're providing our clients. And the initial responses that we're having from them are really positive. They're engaged, and we continue to grow and move this forward.
Declan, over to you. Explain to us your journey.
Good morning, Jake. Good morning, everyone. Foster Nova is a national advisor. We got quite a lot of employee benefits, but on our private client side, about 75 advisors. So our journey has been a case of doing a lot of soul searching. But back to the last year or so, we've had an aspiration in this area for a while. Where we've done that, that's been on a kind of ad hoc basis with our clients who've had come to us. So we've been reactive. So what our journey has been the last year is actually to put in place a proposition where we can proactively approach our clients and actually come with a solution that we think is our version of best endeavors, given obviously what Annette said about the lack of clarity or a kind of recognized framework in place. So yeah, obviously the COVID piece has obviously accelerated some of that momentum already built up. But actually, it does need to be done in terms of the groundwork from the company and actually looking inside the company, how it runs itself as well. Because actually, Annette mentioned authenticity. Clients recognize that very clearly, and they recognize it when it's not there. So I would say to any advisory firms seeking to start this journey, they need a lot of that work internally before actually putting a proposition in place.
Thanks. I'd like to ask each of you in turn a little bit about how you're establishing your value proposition and the types of inputs that you've used to create it, and the kind of resources that you have sought. What is it you find useful, and how have you distilled the minefield? Actually, shouldn't say minefield in a responsible investing. You have to be careful about your analogies. How have you distilled all the information that's out there to formulate your value proposition? George?
We wanted to have a proposition, Jake, that was strong on impact, strong on ESG. So once we'd sort of got that into our minds, we also wanted to be very open. If there was anything in there that was slightly questionable, and again, this is one person's opinion versus another, but we would flag that up. So in our data, we've been very clear with charts and things, bar charts, to show what percentage of our portfolios are impact, what are standard ESG. We've had to rely on external expertise, and I mentioned earlier that our external expertise was John Fleetwood. John, the original founder, I think, and chair of the Ethical Investment Association. He's a Cumbrian, I'm a Lancastrian, so we're not far from each other. And we met up and shared our thoughts. And I'm aware John has now joined the Square Mile team, so congratulations to you, because I think you've got an exceptional character there, both in terms of knowledge of where funds sit in the bigger scheme of things. You know, we all have a worry on the IFA side of the greenwashing that goes on. So John literally, through his research and now your research, investigates all the constituent parts of the various funds and then grades them. And then we can use those graded funds in a contracted universe, as it were, give that to our fund managers, and then they can apply normal portfolio creation techniques using strategic asset allocation and tactical asset allocation. But the universe itself of opportunities is very much based on the work that John Fleetwood's done for us.
Annette, what have you found useful? How have you distilled your value proposition?
Yeah, just picking up on how George introduced there, and saying they made a decision that they wanted to have ESG integrated and have impact in their portfolios. And I think the starting point for us as a business has been to really look inwardly and to make these important decisions. You know, what is our approach to integrating responsible portfolios going to be? Are we looking at an opt-in approach? Are we looking at an opt-out? Because that in itself sends a message to our clients about how we see responsible, sustaining investments. Where do we sit on the spectrum of capital? Do we want to integrate these ESG integration techniques, which are more about just understanding the risks of the portfolio, or as George points out, have an impact? So our research has been broad and extensive and from a range of sources. I echo what Declan would say. You've really got to understand this as a business before you start looking at a product and productizing and putting this out to clients, to ensure that you're delivering it in a really authentic way. So that's been something that's really important to us. I've really enjoyed looking at things like the Investment Association Responsible Investment Framework. I think it's a really useful starting point as a language for us as an industry to start talking about what we mean by some of the terminology that we use. ESG integration is a term that's thrown around quite a lot, but dare I say, different firms mean different things by it. And I think as an industry, we've got a responsibility to start delivering this in a way that consumers feel that they can trust it. So those types of resources, the UNPRI, I found quite useful. Lots of white papers on the outputs from responsible investment portfolios and what they do and don't do, and disposing of some of the myths. So it's really researching very broadly and really understanding internally what you mean by it, so that you can communicate it really clearly to your clients is what I would say the most important factors, and how we've approached this.
Declan, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, pick up on what Annette said. The actual diagram with the spectrum of capital has been very useful to articulate that to clients and bring that within some sort of framework that can actually be usable. But yeah, there is no silver bullet in terms of one resource, research resource. It is a mosaic kind of piece that you need to pick up on very different number of different sources. We also use 3D Investing, John Fleetwood and Worthstone Capital, but also the UNPRIs. There is other kind of impact reporting from independent sources as well. So we're very mindful of the fact that you don't outsource responsibility when you use a research outlet or a number of different outlets. You've got to do a lot of that core thinking yourself, and actually then to actually bring forward to the client so they understand it. So there's a lot of education piece with clients, and that begins at the fact-finding stage for all clients. So we're not just gated it that you're interested in ESG, therefore you go into a different flow. This is actually being integrated into the whole process for all of our clients, because we think it's going to be that mainstream that's actually going to be absolutely an imperative. But you know, you can other advisory firms who are starting, you can get yourselves very kind of thrown into the theory and how do you put that into practice. You know, the Bill Phillips quote of "focus on progress, not perfection" is kind of a little bit of our mantra. You know, you have to start somewhere, and it's going to be an iterative process in terms of improvement. You're going to be somewhere very different in 18 months, 24 months time. But to not start that process, I think, is doing your clients a disservice.
Could I ask each of you briefly, in terms of resourcing product providers, and there's a few watching this session right now. I mean, how do you feel that the message is being conveyed to you by fund management groups? Is there enough decent product out there? Is it the right sort of product for your client? Perhaps platforms, maybe some life insurance companies if you deal with them. I mean, what's the message from them, and is it working for you? George, perhaps some strong views on this.
Well, I'm smiling as you're saying that, Jake, because I am sceptical of most fund management groups. I think you knew that before you asked me the question. Their definition of what ESG is or should be is maybe slightly different to my definition. So there are firms out there that are doing an excellent job. For me, two of them in particular that we've used, and we've brought them up to do presentations and training for our IFAs. One's Web, who I'm sure you're well aware of, and I attend their annual conference, normally down in London. The other is Lion Trust with their sustainable team that they brought across from Alliance Trust. There are others, quite obviously. The Good Investment Guide that comes out every autumn is another good source of who's doing good stuff in this particular arena. And Jake, I'm thinking by your smile, you've got an involvement in the Good Investment Guide now. So that comes out every year. So we're coming up to October, aren't we, anyway? So that would be a good starting place for any IFA looking at this for the first time. If you want to get a copy, we usually download ours off the Good With Money website, but I'm sure Square Mile will have copies available.
George, there'll be 12 fund manager sponsors who I'm sure are very keen to get in touch with you now. Annette, your view on product offerings and how they're helping or not?
I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we've used a very broad range of sources to inform us, and asset managers, product providers have been a useful source of information. But that information is useful. They're starting at a point of why they're in this marketplace, what's their commitment to the marketplace, and building a confidence from our perspective that they're in it for the long term. They're not just in it to gain market share or to make a quick buck. That this is actually something that runs through the core and the heart of their business as well. It's useful when their support is delivered with some academic background and some numbers rather than just jumping straight into solutions. So there's a more holistic approach from the asset manager. So it has been really useful, and I definitely think they have a role to play as part of a broader gathering of information. In terms of products, we work as financial planners, so we don't do portfolio construction, and we work with asset managers for that. And where we've seen more of a gap in the market is ensuring that there are well diversified portfolios across a range of risk profiles, and ensuring that the sustainability impact credentials of those portfolios are articulated really clearly. It isn't always easy to measure impact or articulate impact, but it's important that investment managers and wealth managers are working towards that. Very much reflect upon what Declan said about progress rather than perfection. I think it's important as advisors that you're open to the fact that this is a journey and the whole industry is on this journey. But we do need to see a commitment that that there is work in progress to be able to demonstrate to our clients that this is what your portfolio has done, this is the impact that it's had in a meaningful way, so we can break down the concerns and barriers around greenwashing, and also for internally for us as advisors to feel confident about what we're offering our client. I genuinely feel most advisors in the industry want to do a really good job for their clients. They don't want them to be disappointed. They want them to be really pleased and proud of the portfolio that they have. And it's a lot of responsibility on our shoulders delivering that to our clients. And we're really keen to make sure that we do that in a responsible way.
Declan, just before I get you to answer that question, I just remind our polls should be coming through now. So we should have a poll which is slightly more sophisticated than the state of the weather. But the question is, have you taken any steps to integrate ESG and responsible investing into your CIP? So that poll question should be coming up soon. Declan, you're a gatekeeper to some extent at Foster de Novo. I mean, what's your take on the product sphere?
Yeah, asset managers have a kind of a large responsibility in this area, and as George mentioned, there's some specialists who have been operating in this field for a long period of time, and you find that their outputs actually have a quality and a depth to them. So it's a bit of a curate's egg. I mean, those more mainstream providers, some have had offerings for a while, and then obviously they've moved more towards the fore. But I do think that asset managers need to move beyond kind of the marketing piece to actually give us as advisors the depth. You know, external verification would be one flag that I would say. Have they gone to external people to verify their piece? Do they have independent investment oversight committee members that actually feed in those views and challenge that their external view? So again, you know, there's a lot of progress to be made here, and in terms of quality and alignment to, you know, UN SDGs, which is now the kind of new piece. There is a certain degree of bandwagon jumping here, but also there is good practice that is coming to the fore as well. So yes, you know, if we were grading the asset managers, then yes, more work required, but certainly that there are a number of providers and large providers who have a commitment in this field. So let's see what they come up with.
Excellent. We've got a couple of questions coming in, which is fantastic. I'm going to sort of move the subject matter towards the client experience, and I can weave these questions in as we go. Perhaps if each of you could outline, the poll results are in. 82% have incorporated ESG into the CIP. So that's a fairly good response there. So it's clearly an area of interest. Going back to the client experience for each of you, how are you interacting with your clients and bringing up this subject? Or indeed, are your clients themselves bringing up this subject matter? There's a lot of media, you know, the trade press is picking it up at the nationals, television shows, all sorts of drivers behind, not COVID being one as well. You know, how are you interacting with your clients? If I could quickly ask you each to answer that question, and then I'll pick up on some of the questions that have come in. George.
Okay, well, we started the journey, Jake, with a client survey, which we did both online and hard copy. And we did find the hard copy worked far better, because we needed to test what our belief was. We thought the time had come. This was back in 2016, 2017, but we needed to know where our clients stood on this. And if you remember, I think that was the time of the Blue Planet and David Attenborough and programs on TV. So we put the survey out, and the survey had the results of that survey were absolutely phenomenal. And we found, whereas IFAs typically at that time were saying 10% or less of their clients were interested in this area, we found the answer was more like 70%. And it was like a bolt from the sky to our IFAs, because they suddenly realised this wasn't just a passing fad. This was a major change in the way that the public perceived their investments and their pensions. So that was what really got us going. Since then, every 13 weeks, excuse me, every 13 weeks we run client seminars and IFA seminars, both attend. We're in the northwest of England. We get between about 100 and 125 attending each seminar, and we bring in guest speakers, and we've had the likes of John Fleetwood and George Latham from Webb and Peter Michaelis from Lion Trust have very kindly come up and talked to our clients. So what we've found now over the 3 or 4 years is one person is telling another who is telling another, and we literally now have hundreds of clients who previously you would have just said they were average IFA clients. They weren't people who were particularly looking for ESG, but now they've found it. They're very passionate about it, and it's a little bit like the snowball. It's just growing and growing at a tremendous rate. So that in the main is how we've, from a firm's point of view, how we've been relating with clients.
Annette?
Yeah, it's interesting. George picked up on the statistic of circa 10% of clients being interested in ESG, and I think this is where advisors have a huge responsibility. I think most of us acknowledge that our clients are really reliant on what we tell them and how we guide them, and being in a firm that has historically had an opt-in approach to ESG, a lot of clients don't have the confidence to articulate their views in this area, and what we're seeing is the more that we're talking to them, the more we're asking them questions, the better we're getting at having those dialogues, and the more clients we're finding are interested in these types of portfolios. So you know, we're certainly not at the 70% mark, and we're a long way off it, but I'm optimistic. I really do see that this is the way that the market's moving, and I think it's also supported now that I think it's becoming more broadly acknowledged that making these choices in your portfolio doesn't mean giving up huge amounts of investment return or making huge compromises, and maybe client starting point is that well, if I'm opting into this, I'm opting out of something that's much better. Therefore, they're more nervous about making that step to sustainable, responsible portfolios. And the more information that we've got to break down those barriers and give them the facts on the matter, I think the more and more uptake we're going to see.
Declan, there must be some client misconceptions as well. How do you deal with the clients?
Well, yes, I mean, we're at the start of that point because our proposition has just literally been launched this week. So we'll see that. I mean, George's ideas as an early adopter are excellent in terms of a client survey and regular communication with that. You know, we've incorporated that within our fact-finding suitability assessment. We've obviously then incorporated that within a client-facing document that they can actually have a copy of, that is our articulation of our views on the world. And then it's down to our advisors in terms of their soft skills, in terms of asking those questions of clients. But I think, you know, short kind of videos might be a way forward that we're considering as well, something that's quite digestible as well, because a client says that might be interested in this, it sees the plethora of landscape, might actually be turned off that. Whereas actually we need to make it easier for clients to actually go down this route. So yeah, we're open to different outlets and different ways of communication, but certainly that's going to be an ongoing piece we have with our clients.
Okay, I'm going to just get onto these questions. If you could just each give short answers to these. A question from Howard. Do you use model portfolios for your ESG offerings, or if so, how many? Or is it just a product range on an approved list? George, quickly from you, please. You're on mute, George.
It's bound to happen at some stage of the morning, so I'll put my hand up. I'm the idiot. It's model portfolios for us. There's a lot of work and research behind the scenes that goes into this. So you've got to make the IFA's life as straightforward as you can. Understanding though that we've done a lot of background training with the IFAs, so they're clear at what sits behind these portfolios. But it is model portfolios.
Briefly, Annette.
Yeah, the only difference I would add in terms of the way we work is we don't construct the portfolios internally, so we work with asset managers that construct portfolios. But yes, model portfolios.
Yeah, we construct our own model portfolios internally under discretionary permission. So we've added a sustainable range to that. So it's very much an enhancement of our existing proposition. And where people want to go to more the impact space, will allow that to have a kind of more satellite piece as well.
Another quick question, and again, we're running out of time, so keep these answers short, please. George, how do you integrate ESG impact investing to fact finding? Do you use a separate questionnaire?
We don't use a separate questionnaire, but we several years ago now, we came up with a range of new questions to add to the fact find that we'd already got. So they're in the normal everyday fact find.
Just before I get you to answer, Annette, there's a lot going on here. We're going to move to our second poll as well, which is having heard today's advisor panel, do you believe you have the skill set to implement changes to your CIP to incorporate ESG and responsible investing? And that poll should be flashing up very shortly. Annette, just a quickly response on that question.
Presently, it's just done as part of our fact finding. It's something that we are looking at building a more specific questionnaire in the area to capture clients' views in a more consistent way, but certainly not something we've nailed just yet.
Declan?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we've incorporated it within our suitability assessment. We show the spectrum of capital. We determine where we want to sit within that, and we kind of then ask open questions. So it's the skill of our advisors to get those answers from clients as well.
Excellent. One quick question from Hugh. How much has the requirements next year influenced your decision to improve or offer further ESG and responsible investing? And do you use a document that you can provide to the client to ask their thoughts on this? I think that comes up with the questionnaire as well. Any other thoughts, George?
Sorry, Jake, what was the first part of that question?
The requirements for next year, they're coming in.
Right, no, it's not altered what we're doing at all. I think we were already there, to be truthful.
Yeah. Annette?
Certainly not altered what we're doing, but I think the general energy in the industry has helped move us along, would be fair to say. The regulatory pressures that are coming down, not just from the FCA, but from Europe and across business as a whole, is a wave that's moving this all forward, and I think that's definitely helping with common terminology. So it's positive.
Declan?
Yeah, no, it wasn't our motivation, but we're quite glad we've done it given the regulatory soundings and environment.
Okay, the poll results have come in. 61% of you, yes, it's already in motion. 39% no, will look to secure third-party help, and 0%, it's a fad. So very, very good alignment there. Very quickly, we've got to finish up and we've got about a minute and a half. If I could ask each of you just to summarize your thoughts, and what does success look like for you?
Success with regard to ESG, Jake, is
and responsible investing. Yeah.
Yeah.
As you proceed in your journey.
Yeah, it's well. We start with making sure that we've got the right, the right research and the right product in the first place, and then it's IFAs having the confidence to discuss that, and then ultimately it's the results. It's clients in the medium to long term not only investing in the right area, but making the money that they want to make. Simple as that.
Annette, your future journey, how's it looking?
Yeah, I think success for me is, I would love to see us in a position as an industry where our clients can clearly articulate back to us their portfolios. We've educated them, they understand, and yes, we have more clients invested in responsible, sustainable portfolios, and they're pleased with the results.
Declan, final word?
It is a two-way dialogue with clients, educating them educating us. Success would be our sustainable range becoming the mainstream and knocking out the previous incumbent. It would be as simple as that.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Excellent conversation, and we could go on for hours because it's a fascinating subject matter. Alas, we can't, and I've promised to keep everyone on time, which I've almost done. Ladies and gentlemen, you were listening to George Critchley, the Senior Partner at Pennine Wealth Solutions, Annette Hender, partner at TaylorMade, and that's Taylor for those who enjoy a pun, and Declan McAndrew, Head of Investment Research at Foster de Novo. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
We are now going to move on to the Ask the Expert session. And you will see this is a pre-recorded section where experts are answering pre-submitted questions. If you would like to submit a question, you can email Last Word Media, and the contact name is Margot Lerda, margaux.lerda at lastwordmedia.com. That's margot.lerda@lastwordmedia.com if you're interested in submitting a discussion point for Ask the Experts. And without further ado, I will hand you over to Ask the Experts and Steve.
Hi, my name is Anna Mercer, and I'm a member of the Square Mile research team. The question I wanted to ask you today is, how do you know that ESG is not a fad? And what are you doing to ensure that you're not just jumping on the greenwashing bandwagon? Thanks.
Are we jumping on the bandwagon? At AIGA, we've got a deep heritage in responsible investing. We launched our first responsible investing fund over 30 years ago in 1989. In 2008, we were early signatories to the Principles for Responsible Investment and have consistently scored highly with them since. And we have a strong record of holding companies to account as stewards of the assets we manage. We act with integrity and hold ourselves to high standards. So I'm confident that we are not jumping on the bandwagon. Is ESG a fad? It does feel like that at times, doesn't it, given how frequently the term is used. However, in my view, it's absolutely not. In fact, I take the opposite view. I think the market underestimates how profound an impact ESG is going to have on companies, economies, and financial markets. Why do I think that? Well, sustainable issues are some of the biggest issues facing society. Issues like climate change, access to healthcare, inequality, these are mainstream, high-profile issues. Think about some of the major news stories over recent years. Many are directly related to ESG issues: extreme weather, floodings, drought, wildfires, social issues, racism and inequality. Think about data security and abuse, for example, the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the impact on Facebook. And governance issues. Think about some of the major environmental disasters caused in part by poor governance, the Macondo well disaster, for example, and corporate governance scandals like the recent collapse in Wirecard. So I think societal awareness and appetite to do something about these issues has grown significantly. As a result, ESG and sustainability have risen to the top of governments, corporates, and individuals' agenda. There's a strong consensus that we need to be doing much more. For individuals, consumers, they're becoming ever more sensitive to sustainable issues and are willing to vote with their feet. Think about the war on plastic, the rise in the plant-based diet, the shift in the way people are traveling. And governments are increasingly looking to incentivize sustainable activities and punish unsustainable ones using multiple levers, including fiscal spend, taxation, and regulation. I encourage people to look up the European Commission Sustainable Finance Action Plan to see how seriously lawmakers are taking ESG. The proposals are quite dramatic. And corporates recognize these shifting demands from individuals and governments. Corporates are changing their reason for existence, their very purpose. we're seeing a shift away from traditional shareholder maximisation to a mandate focused on satisfying a wider stakeholder base and society more broadly. So this convergence of individual demand, government intervention and corporate behaviour has created strong momentum in sustainability and ESG, which will only accelerate in my view. This will have a tangible impact on the economy, a tangible impact on demand for goods and services, a tangible impact on the economics of many companies and industries. So clearly there are going to be major winners and losers in this environment, and it's our job to avoid the losers, avoid the companies that are on the wrong side of this secular shift, but to invest in the winners, the companies that are providing solutions to sustainable issues. In our Sustainable Equity Fund, we're investing in long-term solutions to long-term sustainable problems. So no, I don't think ESG is a fad. I think it's a long-term theme that will run for many, many years, and I genuinely believe it's only just begun.
As ESG inflows increase, where does that leave securities such as tobacco and oil?
ESG investing is essentially about identifying risks to the economic value of an asset, those risks coming from environmental, social and governance issues. The approach really complements rather than competes with the traditional focus on the financial outlook for a business and the strength of a company's management. Identifying risks and opportunities and understanding how both the corporate management address those and how the investment community responds to those risks will determine, I think, future returns in those assets. And increasingly, ESG is playing a role in the determination of the forward-looking indicators for a company. What are the risks? There are many, but I would say in this context, we should focus really on regulatory and legal risks related to ESG, but also changing patterns of consumer demand and investor preferences. If we take the example of fossil fuels, most asset managers are signed up to supporting the aims of the Paris Agreement in reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases in order to limit global temperatures to 2% above pre-industrial times by 2050. Fossil fuel-based energy production is by far the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and therefore the biggest contributor to the rise in global temperatures. And there is widespread social acceptance of the need to control emissions in order to reduce the increase in temperatures and in turn to reduce all the risks that are associated with that in terms of adverse weather conditions, flooding and so on. This can be achieved in a number of ways, through explicit control of emissions, through using taxes, through subsidization of renewable sources of energy, and so on. And investors have to be aware of all these complex developments around the single issue of the use of fossil fuels. So, for example, we could possibly see increased carbon taxes in the future. That would be a tax on the use of fossil fuels and the amount of CO2 that use produces. An increased tax on carbon would raise the cost to energy producers and make the cost of traditional energy much more expensive compared to renewable energy, and we're already seeing that. In addition, consumer demand is also changing. There's a preference for cleaner energy. We're seeing a massive increase in the demand for electric cars, for example. Households are moving to demanding more renewable energy sources. We're seeing mitigating activity in both the consumer and the business sector in order to reduce the reliance on fossil fuels. So as consumer demand changes, that changes the economics for fossil fuel producing or fossil fuel based companies. And these are the risks. There's a regulatory risk, a financial risk, a consumer demand risk. And investors have to be aware of those risks, just as they'd have to be aware of traditional risks that would impact on the business outlook for a company. Those risks will lead to a shift in investor and consumer behavior. And it would mean that ultimately companies that are reliant on fossil fuels, for example, would face a higher cost of capital because investors were less willing to commit capital to them. and they would face a decline in revenues relative to other sources of energy production. That means that the economic value of the company gets eroded and the asset becomes less valuable to investors. In the extreme, of course, if we think about oil companies or coal producing companies, the economics could change to such an extent that their assets would be left in the ground and they would be worthless. And we've already seen this happening. The performance of the energy sector in most stock markets has underperformed massively over recent years, and that's likely to continue. The examples of other areas like tobacco and armaments is the same. Regulatory risk, consumer demand risk will both reduce the demand for a product and the revenues of those companies that produce them, but also will increase the cost of capital, and the economics then make the company worth less in the longer term. So really, it's true that a focus on ESG investing can and will reduce the economic value of some corporate assets in the future.
So tell me, in your process, what's more important, the E, the S, or the G, and how do you assess them as part of your portfolios?
It's important to remember that ESG isn't a label. It's a fundamental set of inputs, environmental, social, and governance, that affect all companies and indeed all economies. And it's a fundamental insight that we should be using to assess all investment opportunities. In many ways, governance is a route to good environmental and social practices. The one thing that we know from experience and is backed by academic studies is that good governance is associated with better outcomes, but more importantly, that poor governance, poor management is associated with poor financial performance and weak share price performance. So it's really important to look at governance in all situations, whether it be in the corporate or at the government level as well when assessing fixed income. Environmental, social, and governance factors individually vary across time, across countries, and across industries. So it's impossible to say that one dominates over the other. One thing that we do is assess each of environmental, social, and governance on its own merits in each individual situation. To help us with that, we have developed our materiality matrix. Now, this is an important bit of work that looks at the components of environmental, social, and governance, and then looks at them across industry. So we break it down into the contribution across 80 different industries. The importance of this is that we can then see the material areas that are relevant to that business, that industry, that country. We've developed this with input from the Global Reporting Initiative, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, as well as from our responsible investment team and input from our analysts. It's a great starting point for understanding the relevance of E, S, and G, and it's really important to make sure that ESG itself is not seen as a label, but is a better understanding of business models and the management of economies to ultimately give you the full insight into generating sustainable economic returns.
Thank you, and hopefully those Ask the Expert sessions were useful for you. As Jake said, if you'd like to submit a question, please do using Margot's email address that Jake provided you with. A secondary point, I hope you enjoyed the advisor panel. If you'd also like to take part in that, please again do get in touch. The next session is, given the importance of platforms to the advisor market, how are they going to cope? Over the next events, we have representatives from 3 of the leading platforms in the UK, Standard Life, Funds Network, and Aviva. However, today we have Steve Nelson from the LANCAP, who are recognised as one of the leading commentators on the UK platform market. And they're going to provide their perspective on how they see platforms coping with the challenge of ESG. Over to you, Steve.
Hello everyone, my name is Steve Nelson and I am Insight Director at the Langcat, which is a stupid name really. Not Steve, Steve's a pretty normal name really, but the Langcat is a silly name to name a company, but we're all stuck with it now. Who is the Langcat? Well, the Langcat is a pensions, savings and platforms and investments, all those kind of things in retail investments, consultancy, and we specialise in research, insight, PR and marketing within those parts of the sector. So thank you very, very much to Square Mile for having us on your session today. ESG on platforms, and we have 15 minutes to save the world, which is a big ask, but we're going to try our best over the next 15 minutes or so. Now, the good people at Square Mile asked me to do a little session on what platforms can do to best enable ESG investment via the retail platform sector. And I'm going to talk about a number of things, but I want to break down ESG investment into 3 strands because I think, and it's our theory and our working theory at the Langcat, that ESG investing as a thing is in danger of becoming this big amorphous catch-all phrase for too many different things. And we are in danger of losing sight of how platforms and how investment solutions and how advisors can deliver ESG solutions and ESG investing to clients. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. We're going to break this down into 3 different areas today because they are fundamentally different things. And I think it's important that we bear that in mind. Number 1 is corporate governance. Well, ESG could mean corporate governance. It could mean the art of corporations and asset managers and platforms just doing things better. And of course, that can fall under the ESG umbrella. It can also mean product manufacturing. And the asset management sector in particular has done what the asset management sector always does, and that is develop solutions. And there are Lord knows how many ESG solutions out there in the sector. There was an article on FT the other day saying that in the last couple of years alone, there's been something like 350 different ethical solutions in Europe alone. So ESG could mean a new range of products or a new range of funds or portfolios or discretionary portfolios. And that's a reasonable thing to say as well. The last thing to say is that it could also mean this notion of personalization or individualization. And that is, how do we match individuals' beliefs and ethics and politics and philosophies? How do we get those out of people and get them into investment solutions that match? And that is another challenge for the asset management and the platform sector. So for us at the Langcat, these are very different challenges and very different things. And it's hugely important to bear that in mind, rather than just having this whole catch-all phrase, ESG, which can mean many, many different things to many different people. So, if platforms are part of the answer, then what is the question? And I want us to bear that in mind at all times. What is the question that we are trying to answer? Is it how to clean up, for want of a better phrase? That's not to suggest that asset management or the platform sector is dirty, but is it that we are just trying to get better and trying to develop better solutions and better governance for the planet or for society? Or is it that we are trying to develop tailored and individual solutions for individuals when they come and meet their advisors? And again, I want you to have that at the forefront of your mind when we start to think about what ESG might mean in practice going forward. But as you know, and as I know, it's not as simple as that, Steve, is it? It's absolutely not as simple as that, because if we look at the typical technology suite that exists within advisor firms, then it's not just about the platform. Typical advisor firms have back office systems, have risk profiling tools, cash flow modeling, investment research, client reporting, client portals. Typically, based on our research and based on your experience, I'm sure you would agree, most firms have an ongoing relationship with more than one platform. So it's not just about saying that one platform is at the hub and at the forefront of advisor technology. There's a whole lot more going on behind that. Now, I want to share a hugely enjoyable conversation I had with a very good advisor firm last year when we were conducting one of our many research exercises, and I'm calling this the wholly reasonable advisor paradox. And that's when I was having a conversation with an advisor I know, and he said to me halfway through the conversation, well, I want technology to be as joined up as possible, so I have as few logins and systems to manage. It's overwhelming. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing to believe. It's a perfectly reasonable opinion to have. But the same chap 10 minutes later said to me, well, I'll always default to choosing software that is best of breed. And that's another problem we have in the sector, where technology doesn't speak to each other in a way that we would like to make our businesses run as efficiently as possible. But we do want to retain that ability to choose software that's best of breed and choose processes that are best of breed. So that's a perfectly reasonable problem to have. And it's one that we have at the Landcat as well, where we are trying to grow our business in a rational and a sensible manner. But we have these competing bits of technology that are all competing for our time and trying to help us with our processes. Now, moving on to investment choice on platforms. Now, based on our research and based on other research, we know that round about 80 to 85% of firms are running what they would define as being centralized investment propositions. Now, that's where, I'm sure you don't need me to explain, but that's where we have developed a mechanism and a set of processes where we can now have a one-to-many relationship between advisor firms and clients. And that's been driven by the regulator's need for value for money and consistent outcomes. And we've got to reasonably good places, I think, within the technology sector as to how to enable that and how to help businesses enable that. And based on our research, this is from our annual State of the Advisor Nation research conducted at the tail end of last year. Centralized investment propositions come in many different flavors. So you can see the left-hand bar there, that's when firms are running their own proposition. So typically that's running their own model portfolio suite, either on an advisory or a discretionary basis. So that's all about getting the building blocks into place, getting the asset allocation right, rebalancing on a regular basis, researching whether you need to substitute holdings, etc., etc. Round about half of firms are saying that they outsource to a discretionary manager, so just over 50% there. About 3/4 still saying that they use multi-manager or multi-asset funds, and just over half saying that they use a packaged range. Now, the eagle-eyed among you will know that if you add all of those bars together, you get far higher than 100%. And that's because the vast majority of firms that we speak to are running more than one of these methodologies. Around about 85%, in fact, are mixing and matching the different types of centralized investment propositions that they use. And now that has huge implications for embedding ESG methodology or ESG preferences into a process when you have different methodologies running within your firm. And each of those different methodologies will have their own needs from technology when trying to embed ESG preferences. Now, so we've talked about how technology can support a business. We've talked about some of the problems that can cause between the spaghetti junction of different technology component parts that make up the stack of technology that supports a business. And we've then looked at how most advisor firms are running different types of centralized investment propositions. But you've asked me, how can platforms help firms and the wider sector embed ESG preferences within their business and within these processes? Well, for me, it comes back to that original point that I made in that ESG means more than one thing. And we're on a dangerous road if we just have it as this big, ugly, amorphous blob of articles and processes and products and fund ranges and beliefs and tools and risk profiling algorithms, when actually it means different things to different people at different points in the chain. So it could mean corporate governance. If you believe that platforms and entities have a responsibility to embed ESG methodology within their firm, well, there's many things that they can do, and you better believe that this is on the agenda of every platform in the sector. Now, whether that's their own corporate governance, whether it's their own carbon footprint, it's on their agenda. And a lot of that is abstracted away and difficult to get a look through into what's going on. And that's in, corporate governance committees and risk frameworks and ongoing meeting agendas that are going on month after month and quarter after quarter. So if you ask me, what is it you need to look for? Well, that's an entirely personal choice. And you've got to make your peace with who you partner up with as an entity. The platform sector has made great strides in the last few months in terms of moving towards a paperless environment for many processes. Now, the cynic among me, and I'm sure the cynic among you, would say, well, they've had to do that because of COVID-19 and because we've all had to move into a remote working environment. So of course there's an element of truth in that, but I think they do deserve a little bit of credit for finally starting to move into more paperless environment and developing signatureless processes online. In terms of who is it worth looking at here? Well, in many walks of life, it is always worth looking at the specialists and looking at the smaller providers. And a good instance of this is Platform One, so P1, who have a specific part of their business who are dedicated to embedding ethical beliefs and ethical practices into their organization. And they're one of the first entities that we've seen, certainly in the platform sector, who are getting external help onto their governance framework in order to hold them to account and to make sure that they're not just greenwashing their practices. Now, moving on to product manufacturing. So if you believe that actually the best way to embed ESG beliefs and ESG investing into your processes is to partner with specific fund ranges or specific portfolio ranges, well, then you're going to need information pushed towards you from your platforms. Now, platforms and products for many years have invested in look-through technology or X-ray technology, the likes of Old Mutual Wealth, who were previously Scandia, of course, and who are now Quilter. We're one of the first to adopt X-ray technology looking at underlying holdings. So one way to help advisor firms with evidencing the ESG credentials of certain fund ranges and portfolio ranges is to develop the technology to push that information to you. Now, the big problem with that is that what does consensus look like? How do we get ourselves to a place in the sector where we agree on what ethical or good ethics looks like? And of course, the real problem with that is that varies from person to person and from entity to entity. And you only need to look towards Boohoo as an example. And I know everybody's probably going to talk about Boohoo today and in future sessions in some shape or form. But you only have to look at Boohoo, who passed so many supposed ethical screening criteria and as a stock holding made its way onto so many ethical fund lists. But then we've all seen what's happened since then, and how are consumers who are ethically minded or ethically active, how are they going to feel when they find out down the line that a stock holding like Boohoo and like many other things has found its way onto a supposed ethical screening criteria and an investment choice. So that's a huge challenge for the sector, right? And it's one that we're all going to have to get on board with and somehow find a consensus. And MiFID II is a perfect example of where at sector level, so MiFID II costs and charges disclosure, where we have had a forced consensus put upon us, where we've had to look again at how information is aggregated and then pushed outwards. So how that's going to be driven towards ESG investment is a huge challenge. And the last thing to talk about is this notion of personalization. And that is a huge challenge for everyone. And that is how to match an individual's personal ethics and personal beliefs to an investment portfolio when so much of the sector is geared towards consistent outcomes and the architecture to deliver those consistent outcomes is wrapped up in centralized investment propositions. And that's everything to do with audit trails and permission handling and version control architecture. So anything that the platforms can do to evolve that and to enable this idea of personalization while still retaining consistent outcomes for clients, that's a huge challenge. And we can look towards the likes of what Standard Life, in partnership with FNZ Technology, have done on their investment hub, on X Hub as they call it, where they've started to develop individual customization on top of discretionary portfolios. So that was a very, very quick whistle-stop tour through 15 minutes as to how we can potentially save the world. We're clearly not going to save the world in 15 minutes, but hopefully I've given you a very quick tour as to what the platform sector can potentially do to help advisor firms develop better ESG processes and better ESG solutions for your clients.
Thanks very much, Steve, and those nice people at the Lancat, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Asset Manager panel discussion. My name is Richard Romer-Lee. I'm MD of Square Mile, and I'm really excited about this discussion we're about to have with three very knowledgeable and very prominent people in the industry. The topic of today's panel is ESG. What is it, and what are fund groups doing? And before I introduce our panelists, we're going to put up our next poll to try and get an idea from the audience as to what they think. So please can we run poll number 4, which is, where does ESG start as an asset manager? Is it a cultural thing, part of the firm's DNA, led by the investment team, or is it a marketing gimmick? So whilst you're thinking about that, I'm delighted to be joined today by Sarah Peasy, who's an investment strategist at Legal & General Investment Management, by Charlie Thomas, who's Head of Strategy, Environmental and Sustainability and a Fund Manager at Jupiter Asset Management, and Saka Nusebe, CBE, who's Chief Executive at Federated Hermes. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. It's wonderful to see you. So, I'm just waiting for the results of the poll to come up. And interestingly, what we're hearing is 75% think that ESG should start as a cultural thing. It should be part of the firm's DNA, so 3/4 of the audience. 20% is led by the investment team, and 2% think it's a marketing gimmick. So it's starting to get through. So without further ado, let's kick on with our first question, which is, what does ESG mean to you? And we've heard from Steve that it means more than one thing. So what does ESG mean to you, and where does it fit in an asset management company? Sarah?
Yeah, so it's good to know we've only got 2% skeptics in the room today, which is fantastic. So yeah, no, good morning everybody, and thank you for taking the time, I guess, to hear what we've got to say today. And yeah, no, I think it's a huge question, and it's something which is obviously so prominent in the industry today. But ESG as a whole, but for Legal & General, I see in a very, very simplistic way, it's a lens, it's an additional lens to actually assess a company for its long-term sustainability. This isn't necessarily something which is new to the industry. We've been assessing ESG in different ways for many, many years. We just perhaps haven't necessarily given it this iconic title that it seemed to have gathered in the last 3 years or so. But for us as an organisation, ESG sits with the responsibility of every financial professional, and that's kind of where my role comes in. And I have the wonderful kind of 50,000 view above our investment platform. And whether you're a portfolio manager, a research analyst, or even within our investment stewardship team, it's everybody's responsibility to integrate ESG. So we don't have a separate team. It's not a bolt-on. And that likewise, that hopefully comes through in the investment decisions that we take, and obviously the products that we offer our clients as well.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to move up. I'm going to move on to Charlie now. As Charlie, you run a number of funds where it's embedded in what you're doing at an asset manager company where perhaps you're ahead of other parts of the business. So what is ESG to you, and where should it sit? Where do you think it should sit?
Thank you, Richard. Kind of the way I think about ESG is I actually sort of I put it into different compartments, because I think it, as it's rightly being pointed out, it's kind of covers a huge variety of different issues. But I think it can be separated. I think it's important to separate, actually, because I think it provides clarity. So I think it's kind of one level. You've got to think about it from some ethical and norms basis. I think that's an important aspect, and there are funds that sit within that. Clearly, now very much in focus is that greater and wider ESG integration across all funds. I would say for the most part, what we see in that format is that that's predominantly taking a kind of more risk-based approach, in the sense of we're assessing ESG as a potential risk for our investment. So that's an important and growing part of it. Where I guess I sit as an active fund manager, and who's been doing it for nearly 20 years, is we really focus on the opportunity side. So really much seeing ESG through investing in companies which are sort of generally providing the solutions. And for us, that's really the core for what we do and how we think about it. And so those are the kind of three core lenses or three core approaches that we view ESG from, and bearing in mind that it is evolving and changing all the time.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. And do you think in your firm, clearly you've been doing this for 20 years, your funds have been, or some of your funds have been around for over 30. Do you find that you're leading the way for your firm, or they're working alongside you? Or?
Yeah, it's been a fascinating journey. I'll be quite honest. If I look back, 20 years ago, dare I say, we were the greens in the corner. Investing in these kind of wacky things called wind turbines and the like, and we had to work hard to so engage some other fund managers. I have seen that a complete sea change in terms of how other fund managers within the firm with Jupiter, clearly led by the CIO office and their drive as well, but actually other fund managers getting engaged in it, and I think that's been a really fascinating journey to kind of see that change. It is still going on. There are leaders and there are laggards within every firm and every firm. Absolutely, I understand that, but it's so difficult. It's so different, that kind of conversation that I have now with other fund managers than I would have had 15 years ago.
Okay, thank you. And Saka, good morning. Nice to see you. At Federated Hermes, my understanding is this is ingrained into the DNA. So what does ESG mean to you, and why is your firm established in the way that it is?
So my firm is, well, thank you very much. And thank you for both panelists who said lots of things that I completely agree with. I mean, I think my firm was established some 30 odd years ago precisely to do this, when it was the in-house manager of the BT. And I think we approach it slightly differently, and we say that it goes the following. To us, there is no way that you can be a fundamental long-term investor if you don't think about what today is called ESG. And if you break it down, of course, you're going to think about the sustainability of the business. Of course, you're going to think about the governance of the business, both in terms of protecting your right as a shareholder, but also protecting the CEO from making mistakes. And of course, you're going to think about, if you like, what more sophisticated investors would call fat tail risk. I mean, that is what ESG is. So to us, the difference between long-term investing and trading is ESG. If you don't do ESG, if you don't integrate in everything you do, and most fund managers used to do it without realizing that they did it. That's the first element. But there's another thing that added to that, and I agree with Charlie. There's been a move towards this, which is quite extraordinary. When we helped write the PRI all these years ago, there weren't that many people. Now lots of people come and which is a good thing. But the second thing that we did, again, not me, but a predecessor of mine, he worked out a very long time ago, and that's it started off with a guy called Ross Kotani, who was the CEO at the time, CIO, and then Ross Scooby, who's a very famous name in the city. And they worked out that there has to be a relationship between the investor and the company that is about long-term value creation, and that's stewardship. And to us, that's the second part of it. You have to have stewardship, which means not voting, but actually means much more about a 10-year engagement with a company, about ensuring that you help them generate the best long-term returns. But because at the end of the day, there is no dichotomy between ESG and generating returns. In fact, I'd say exactly the opposite. I cannot see as a fundamental manager how you can invest without. So for us, it's how we do business. Now, There are other thematic things that we do. We'll come and talk about them. The sustainability funds we're going to launch, the impact funds we've helped launch, and so on. But in essence, it should be part of how you do it. If you're an active manager, I can't see what else you do.
Okay, so fascinating. So try to get across here to our advisor audience why this matters so much for investors. So Saka, you're talking about it's part of the relationship between investors and companies and what they can achieve in the longer term. But how do you boil down, Sarah? How do you boil down why this is so important for investors?
Well, I think we take the last 6 months of all of our lives as a perfect example of this. And I think the COVID-19 crisis in particular has shone a light on the fact that there are so many unsustainable industries absolutely packed within all the global indices and products that we invest into today. So it's shining a light on that unsustainability as opposed to just always focusing on the really good companies and the sustainable ones. And for us, this is where it answers the question that a lot of investors still have that may be skeptical around ESG. And it's the question of will this compromise my returns? And for that exact reason, in terms of actually shining a light on these unsustainable industries, be it healthcare, education, transport, energy, so many of them, this is exactly the reason why we fully integrate ESG and we believe in it. And the price discovery mechanism for a lot of these industries isn't discounting the risks fairly, particularly when you come to topics like climate change, which are so prominent and affect so many sectors and companies as a result. So for us, this is why it's so important to us as an industry. Asset managers are huge gatekeepers of capital. We have huge responsibility to drive a lot of these change in these big social challenges that we're all facing. But equally, we want our clients and the underlying companies that we invest into to be engaged with us and understand these challenges and what we're trying to do with the capital we're allocating.
Okay, so being responsible stewards of capital and helping to drive these societal changes, which are so important. Amongst some investors and some advisors, there's great cynicism about the return and risk profile that investors may experience by investing in this way. Saka, what do you say to that, and what is the reality?
So I'd say two things, and by the way, I agree with everything that Sarah said, but I'd say two additional things. Look, academic research has shown very clearly that the hit ratio for even the best fund managers doesn't exceed something like 33%, if you take the number of funds that consistently outperform the benchmark over the long term, right? By the way, the average hit ratio for professional poker players is 57%. So just to be clear. Now, why is that? And I'd argue it's not that because we have bad fund managers, but it's because a lot of fund managers take a short-term horizon, not a long-term horizon. If you take a long-term horizon, you will start worrying about things other than next quarter's earnings or even next year's earnings. You'll start paying attention to things like culture because you know this affects the long-term ability of a company to function and to be successful in the long term. If you do that, then you'd find that you've invested in companies that in this crisis have had the culture to survive and avoided companies that in this crisis actually have folded. If you pay attention to long-term issues like the millennials are moving towards, for example, eating less meat and using less throwaway clothing, you would already be coming out of certain parts of retail, which is doomed, and going into other parts of manufacture, which is not. So to me, it's a sort of a fallacy to think that ESG is a separate thing that you do to measure its returns. I'd argue any manager who has a fantastic 10-year track record is applying ESG, whether they know it or not. She does not think about it necessarily, but actually she is thinking about these things and integrating them. The difference is that now we're becoming conscious about integrating and thinking about them. And so I would end it by saying integrating it plus stewardship, that's important, actually does improve your performance over the long term. And that has been our experience over 33 years at what is now called Hermes, Federated Hermes, which used to be called Hermes.
So that is now a myth in terms of you have to forego performance and take more risk. Charlie, how would you elaborate on that?
I think that is correct, absolutely. Some additional points, because I think both Sarah and Saka have covered a lot of it, but I think some important things, just as a kind of day-to-day manager in this kind of area, is that we also recognise as an industry, we're being pushed by the regulator to disclose more. I think a very, very important aspect is being genuine. Clearly, everyone here has very much been involved in the sector for a long time, but there is genuine sort of concerns around issues of greenwashing and the like, and so I think this kind of genuine factor is really, really important, that you can illustrate that, you can demonstrate that. I think those are aspects which we as an industry are probably improving all the time, having come from a relatively low base, I would argue. But I would also point that in terms of where we see opportunity, that's where we've probably seen the greatest kind of change. I mean, if I look back to when I took over the funds, 2003, I mean, we had roughly 300 companies in the world which we would have considered providing solutions. So kind of the sustainability challenges. Now, if you move that on to where we are in 2020, that's 1,400 and growing all the time. So actually the underlying investment opportunity has also greatly enhanced over that time frame, driven by policy, very important in our space, driven by technology advancements, incredibly important in our space, but also the underlying trends around demographic growth, the type of demographic growth that we're seeing around the world. So there are other additional factors which we think are very important to kind of add to kind of Sarah and Saka's points.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. And ladies and gentlemen in the audience, I would urge you to continue to send your questions in via the Slido app. Please do, and we can put them to the panel. There's a couple of questions I've had. They're sort of similar, so I'll throw them out together. One, it says, why are not all funds provided ESG compliant and sustainable? And the other, which is the other side of that, is, do you see a world where every fund has a responsible objective? So Saka, let's start with you on that.
So we're going to come into sort of the naming of names, if those of you old enough to remember that poem from school. So the first thing is, should all funds sort of be responsible and integrate ESG? The answer is yes, and in any case, as Charlie said, regulation is moving that way, and the society is moving that way. So I think that is true. I think sustainable is something that you have to be careful about because it has a very specific meaning, specifically here in the United Kingdom. The problem we have is that people name different parts of ESG differently around the world. We don't have a common language that we use. Sustainable specifically relates to environmental issues, and I think there's a place for a sustainable suite of funds, as there are for sustainable impact funds, and indeed we're bringing out a whole suite of funds that do that. And I think very soon, and I think you will find that we'll move to a stage where you will have specific sustainability funds, specific impact funds. But at the end of the day, I can't see how any active manager can be an active manager without integrating ESG. I can't see how any index provider can be a proper index provider, beta provider, without integrating some sort of stewardship, which is another way of saying you have long-term stewardship of the capital. And this is an inevitability of how the market is going.
Okay, thanks. Sarah, your view.
Yeah, no, I largely agree with everything Saka said. In addition to that, all I would say is I think we're definitely, and I'll be honest, far quicker than I perhaps even anticipated, moving to a world where some of these metrics become as standard as the risk and return objectives and yields and credit spreads and all of those things we're so familiar with today. I can easily see ESG metrics becoming and working quite closely in parallel to them. So as investors, you just have this expectation to see and be able to evaluate funds on that basis. And yes, a big driver of this is out of our hands and is very much now in the hands of the regulator. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing at all. We need to have this more holistic and standardized way of being able to assess funds which sit more along the spectrum of the ESG, whether it's just simply looking to raise market standards or it's more towards
impact part of the spectrum. But one thing that I'm definitely seeing more of is rather than an objective being purely just sustainable and general in nature, I'm starting to see more clients looking to want to actually tailor that objective more directly to them. So what are their values? What do they want to actually express through the underlying holdings within their funds? So I think this is a new area and a very, very exciting area where we start to perhaps become more bespoke with the objectives which are more relevant to that individual investor rather than it just being everybody's sustainability objective.
Okay, so we can look forward to even more funds being available in the market. And it was a point that Steve brought up in the LANCAT presentation beforehand about the need for personalisation. So Charlie, what are your thoughts? And if I can be slightly mischievous, you say a lot of your colleagues are catching up. In Saka's firm, it's ingrained in what they do. Is there a need to teach old dogs new tricks as you get more established fund managers to try and embrace the changes in the world? How do advisors and fund buyers get their head around that?
I think it's a little bit unfair just to say all my colleagues are laggards. I'll be completely honest. I think some of them are very much at the forefront of what's going on in this area, which is actually very exciting. I think one of the biggest challenges as a kind of a fund manager is that with the emergence of ESG, the focus around greater transparency, great from companies, very importantly, in terms of the types of data feeds that we're getting, is how you take that data and how you analyze it. That's probably the next step in terms of understanding ESG data. What's the long-term impact in terms of the cost of capital for firms or the ability to finance and those types of issues? And that's where I think a very interesting next phase we will go through as an industry, as we get better and better quality data from companies around these types of issues. Let's be frank, some of the data is still coming from companies is still a bit sketchy. If I take myself way back, 20 or 30 years ago, I was, as part of my kind of postgraduate thesis, I was kind of created a kind of reporting mechanism on climate change. Now, I'll be quite honest, a lot of it hasn't evolved that much further since in that time frame. So I still think there is a vacuum, a slight vacuum in terms of data coming out from companies from which we can, as fund managers, can properly analyze and understand the longer term implications as a business.
Okay, and how much of a challenge then, and we'll come on to the challenge for advisors in terms of understanding what the industry is doing to help their clients. How much of a challenge is it as an asset manager to invest in this way, as Charlie talks about, sometimes the quality of data coming out and so on? Is it very much you've got to do more work yourself, you've got to build stronger relationships with the businesses? Saka, how do you go about it?
So the short answer is it just means you have to have more data and you have to have more standardized data, and the regulator is moving in that way. I sit as chairman of a group set by the Bank of England to come up with how to report a set of data with carbon footprint, for example. But it's more than that. If I go back to 85, 86, active managers used to do a lot more of what I think of as fundamental research than I think they do today. It was much deeper dive because the data generally about companies was not that available. And I think Charlie's got it exactly right. There are two things that needs to happen. We have to have more raw data that we can analyze, but we also have to have the ability to analyze them better. And we have to have far longer stretches of being connected to the company to really understand it. At the end of the day, that's what active management is meant about anyway. You're meant to sort of be paying people because they can find stuff that other people can't find, avoid therefore companies that other people think are perfectly safe, but actually invest in companies that other people might not really quite realize the long-term potential. This is why I started off by saying it's about time horizon. It's about being long-term rather than short-term. And this is why I started by saying I can't see how you can be a truly active fund manager and add alpha, let's use that word, if you don't integrate ESG, because I can't see how it can be done.
So I hear that very clearly. And Sarah, you represent a business that does both here. Is this really something that active will have an edge, in which active investing should have an edge? And will it be the case that they lead the market and of course passive follows what active does?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think active will always have the edge in being able to maybe be able to more clearly demonstrate this impact, or the impact that we're trying to capture that the underlying companies are having. Whereas obviously from a passive perspective, you are creating a more diversified investment and arguably seeking to raise the market standards more widely as opposed to more targeted. But one approach that we've taken, or we decided to take late last year to help, I guess, create a level playing field across the piece, agnostic to asset class, agnostic to management style, most importantly as well, was to set up what we call a global research and engagement platform, where instead of having our credit and our equity analysts and our investment stewardship team all working independently and within their own functions, we combine them, and we combine them into their sector expertise, whereby if we want to focus in on a financially material topic of one particular sector, we have all of our best brains in the company working on that, but equally we're able to then bring together the engagement effort as well. So if a company comes in, and this has happened before, believe it or not, we could meet the chairman on the Monday. Our investment stewardship function could meet the chairman on the Monday. On the Tuesday, the CEO could come in and meet our equity team. And then on the Wednesday, we could have the CFO in and meeting our credit team. And all of the questions that are happening in those meetings and the targets that we are setting that company to potentially improve and enhance, obviously, the long-term returns that we're looking to objectively achieve out of that company, we want that to be through one voice, rather than it being a disparate message. Because the products that we run for our clients, be they in an active space or in a passive space, the companies are consistent still, and we want them to believe that when they invest with us, be it on either basis, they're still getting the same investment objective, and they're still getting the same investment thinking behind those underlying companies. And over time, we think it's obviously going to be beneficial for us to then track the change and be able to demonstrate the change in these companies if we're all collectively working in this agnostic way. So that's how we're hoping to be able to demonstrate it across the piece, whether you come to us for a passive proposition or an active one.
Okay, and as you're there, Sarah, I'm going to stick with you because another question has come in from the audience. With the ever-increasing use and recommendation of tracker funds, how can these funds possibly meet ethical and ESG objectives?
So ethical and ESG objectives, we have to be very clear from the outset that they're two very different things. From an ethical perspective, you could argue this was the origins of ESG back in the day, where we're actually seeking to actually remove certain sectors or companies which are driven by ethical beliefs. Whereas ESG is more holistic in nature in terms of the sustainability that we're looking to unlock and identify within a company. So they're two very different things. From a tracking fund perspective, there are obviously a growing number of funds out there that are offering both. You can definitely obviously get ethical-based products, but you can also get ESG-based products. How do you identify which ones are actually doing what they say on the tin and which ones perhaps aren't? Well, it's a case of actually looking at how, A, the funds are constructed, for one. Are they using perhaps underlying ESG scoring functions to be able to tilt towards companies and away from the bad ones? How effective is that? What are the tracking error implications as a result of that versus effectively an equivalent market cap or tracker equivalent? So they're the first things you need to establish in terms of the product. The second thing is actually looking at the engagement policies, the stewardship which is undertaken at a firm-wide level. Is that firm that is running that fund using every vote? Do they take that opportunity to take up that seat at the table every time? Because that ultimately is going to raise the standards of your funds. Yes, collectively, we need to do that as an industry. Us as legal and general investment management, there are limitations to what we can do on our own. We understand that, but we are driving the message and driving change. But last of all, what I would say as well, most importantly, is does this product hit your financial objective as well? Your financial objective and your ESG objective shouldn't be mutually exclusive. these two should be able to be delivered as one. So that's a really important aspect as well.
Okay, Charlie Sackett, it would be remiss of me not to let you respond, both representing active houses. Do you agree, or do you have a slightly different view?
So,
feel free
funny
to
enough,
say, as you said.
I completely agree with Sarah about, like I said at the beginning, there is very much a place for passive if you apply a stewardship lens to it. Just to go in history, we launched in '85, I think, I'm not 100% sure, if not the earliest, then perhaps one of the earliest index funds outside of Vanguard at the time in '85. And that's how the stewardship business was born, right? We have academic proof that active stewardship increases performance. So yes, you can have index funds that apply stewardship, and that's good. And active managers who combine stewardship and active price discovery, as Sarah has outlined, actually add more value, and we have proof of that too. I think the main thing that Sarah said, which is very important, is to be clear about the differentiation between ESG, which is, I repeat, is simply the only way that you can invest to make money in the long term. I can't see how else you can do it. And between ethical funds, which now we call thematic funds. So if you have an impact fund, and again, we've been involved with the Council of Impact from the beginning, this is investors wanting to use their money not just for returns, but for a particular purpose. Now, that is a specific purpose. Sustainability funds, as I said, in this market, tend to mean something to do with carbon footprint and global warming. That is a thematic fund that is much more ethically inclined than ESG and tends to be more inclusionary rather than inclusionary. So there are two markets developing here. And the point that I heard from our other panelists is exactly right. There is demand now from clients, from society, and there's a push from the regulator to go that way.
Okay, so, Charlie, there's another question here which I think is quite interesting. It says, do fund managers see themselves as competitors in the ESG responsible space, or is there a more collaborative approach to attaining best practice?
It's an interesting discussion. I would probably say that there are more funds and more houses coming into the space, you might argue there is more competition. But I think there is a strong alignment with the vast majority of fund managers in this space in terms of driving good performance from an ESG perspective. And I think that's perhaps where it's because that's how the industry has evolved. Looking back again, apologies for looking back, but it was a kind of a cottage industry at the beginning. There was just a few of us going around kind of asking these questions and the like. That has obviously, and I guess you've got that some natural connection that's evolved over time. So as an industry, I'm very positive that there is a kind of broad push as a group. But undoubtedly, I mean, surely at the margin there is greater kind of competition around it, because obviously there is all firms are trying to do their best in terms of asset gathering and the like. But I think that understand it from the DNA point, I think that's important, and I think that still exists today.
Okay, does anybody want to add any of that before we move on? Anything to add?
All I would say to that, if that's okay, if I can just jump in, is I think it's both. We're collaborators and we're competitors. We're collaborators when it comes to stewardship. As I've already touched upon, some of these challenges that we're facing as a society require collaboration between asset managers to really, really drive change. And we've got so many examples of that. And one of our biggest ones was BP last year in terms of driving change through climate policies. And it was collaboration with other asset managers which drove that change. However, at the same time, what ESG allows us to do, and I'll go back to my comment at the very, very start, is to look at companies through a different lens. So the portfolio managers that we have and the research analysts that we have, if they choose to use that lens as effectively as possible, we will still hope to identify risks and opportunities which our competitors and other asset managers won't. And then it's our discretion as to how we apply that, and we overweight, underweight companies. So that's the competitive part of it, which still allows us to trade and invest how we would objectively use any other financial metric as well.
Okay, I'm keen to try and help the advisors out there now do a couple of things. And the first thing is, obviously, as you've all articulated incredibly well, this is very complicated, it's multifaceted, and it sits at the very core of what you're doing. There's lots of confusion about terminology, even more confusion about how do advisors, or what do you do to help advisors understand and evidence what you're doing so that they can build that trust with their clients and deliver the outcomes their clients are looking for. Saka, can I come to you on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, we have collaborated with academic institutions for quite a long time, and we have quite a body of evidence that we can, forgive me, I'm going to think this up. We have quite a body of evidence that we can show. So, for example, on how stewardship, active stewardship, which is what we define stewardship as, adds value, we have academic evidence that shows substantial outperformance of the companies we've engaged with against the index over time, and that's been vetted by third-party academics, and we can share that with people if they want it. For example, on the outperformance of specific parts of the E, S, and the G, again, we have academic research, and we're happy to share that with consultants and with advisors. And we're also happy to show them how we break down our performance, where we've outperformed to these elements that we've talked about as an example. So we like to be evidence-based. Where we can, we have shared what we found actually on open domain, so that not just advisors, but actually fellow fund managers might benefit from it. So some time ago, for example, we published a piece of work that evidenced how adding the ESG factors, just to use it, into simply high yield portfolios can substantially increase your returns. And we publish that, so it's open domain. And again, we can show this to advisors. So we're willing to take your hand and show you in evidence that the integration of ESG actually adds to value if you apply it correctly. Now, Sarah is exactly right. There is a skill here, like some fund managers like Charlie are skilled. Some fund managers, like I probably was many years ago, are not skilled. But that's skill, right? It's the using of that ability that then allows you to go and add value. But let's not forget, this is the way to make money over the long term.
Sure. Okay, Charlie. In terms of helping advisors understand the impacts that your investment strategy is having, what are you doing to help them understand that?
I think it's really about transparency. I think that's a really important component. I think transparency and genuine, clear articulation of what you do and how you do it. And I think those are two really important points when you're trying to convey to a potential client. And I think it's important for clients to ask those questions. I think that's a really good starting point, because I think you very quickly get to understand how they do think about it, because as we've talked about it, ESG is different for different fund managers. It's different for me, who focus on solutions. It's different to a fund manager who integrates ESG. It's different from one region. So ESG is different, let's say, if you're talking to Asian companies, than it would be if you're talking about short-dated bonds. And so I think all that put together, it's that ability to distill it and be transparent and articulate to clients, and for the clients to ask that to genuinely understand that they're committed in terms of their understanding of those issues and how they actually how they demonstrate it in the portfolio.
Okay. I've had another question coming from the audience. I'm sorry, Sarah, I'm going to throw it at you again, but it says, unless asset managers work together on a common protocol, how do advisors blend portfolios with defined objectives? So I suppose there's how can you go about building portfolios to spread the risk, if you like, between different managers and create the asset mix that you want?
So there's lots of frameworks out there, and probably that there's a growing number of frameworks out there to assess ESG at a portfolio level and from a bottom-up perspective, obviously at a company level as well. And there's certain ones which are definitely, I guess, starting to take the lead. A couple for us, for instance, that we use most widely, or we adopt most widely, are like the TCFD frameworks and regulation around that. And naturally, our client base is there's a huge proportion of that in the pension market, and there's new pension regulation coming next year, which is going to require all pension schemes to actually be reporting on a TCFD basis. So this is all linked to climate and being able to show your climate footprint, but equally that you're stressing portfolios against certain scenario outcomes. So we look to be able to support our clients who want to be able to demonstrate and publish these kind of returns. That's kind of the first one that works both beneficially to us internally, but also beneficially to clients as well, because all asset managers should be supporting that. But something that we look at very, very widely from more of an investment process perspective and how we can find that continuity between companies is something called SASB, so the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and the framework that they've put together on financial materiality. So this is a way of really starting to expose the risks at a sector level, a long-term risks at a sector level, and how that affects the underlying companies from more of a financial lens, as opposed to just a pure, I guess, real ESG basic lens. So there's lots of frameworks out there which are starting to really be adopted. And I'd encourage definitely the advisors to push their managers on this, ask them to be able to demonstrate it, ask them what they think's important and coming down the pipe. We're the ones that obviously should be most aware of the regulation and what good looks like and what bad looks like, and speak to us. The one thing that I would say with all of this, though, is imperfection is definitely better than inaction at the moment. Nothing is necessarily perfect. Even us as asset managers, believe it or not, we're not perfect. But open that dialogue with us, ask us and push us on the transparency, because this is going to build your knowledge. It's going to help us to be able to also build products and reporting, which is going to help you in the long term.
Okay, thank you. Saka, Charlie, is there anything else that you would add to what Sarah said in terms of trying to help advisors achieve some commonality?
I think I'd say to them, they're right to ask for commonality, but I'd say realistically, it will take some time to evolve because people look at it differently. I think, again, I agree with Sarah. Things that affect regulation, TCFD, I mean, what's pushing that is essentially the regulators pushing that through. I mentioned that I'm sitting on the Bank of England's committee on that, which is all the other fund managers trying to come up with a set of TCFDs that we like. Integrated reporting, we sit on the council of that, as well as SASB is a way of getting companies to report in a way that then we have a common background. But going back to Charlie's point, it's about transparency. So I think that if the advisors push the fund managers, they will find that there are common threads, whether they're speaking to Charlie or speaking to Sarah or one of my people, there are common threads. You can then compare, and then you can decide how to go forward, because you can clearly see how it's articulated, and then ask for it to be evidenced. In the same way that if somebody says to you, I'm a great global fund manager, you say, okay, so evidence it. Show me how much your return is adjusted for risk after fees. I mean, that's evidence, right? I'm a great integrated SGO, really evidence it. Well, has it had value? Has it had detracted value? How would your portfolio look at without it? I integrate stewardship, that adds value. Okay, evidence it. Well, this is not voodoo. We're trying to actually do something that should be demonstrable if you ask for it.
Okay, thanks. We've got a couple of minutes left. So there's another question that I'd like to ask to you is, there's so much choice out there. What would your advice be to advisors when they're looking for asset managers to look after their clients' money here? So what should they look for both at a company level and an individual fund or strategy level? Charlie?
I think my personal view is that I think they need to understand a lot of the work that groups like the IA have done in terms of describing and categorizing this whole area of responsible income. I think that for me that's critical, because I think what we're in danger of, and we've already even in the conversation that we're having amongst ourselves now, is that there is still confusion around terminology. And the sooner we can get to a clear, demonstrable, definitional differences between the different areas, be it ethical, be it ESG, be it sustainable / thematic, then that's really important, because I think that's where the challenge is. We need, or advisors need to know what they're buying for their underlying clients. And I think the terminology is a confusing point. The sooner that's kind of sorted out for the industry, the better, because I think that helps to provide them, to the underlying client, the transparency of what they're getting and what that fund is about, what its objectives are about, and what its purpose is about. And for me, that's a really important aspect.
Okay, so just to be clear, the IFA's framework, the IA's framework, you think is a helpful one?
I think it's a good one. I was a part of that process of creating it, being on the sustainability committee, and I think it resonates. And what they did was, take the best of of what was out there already in the industry, and help to kind of formulate it within a UK context. But I think it's a very good starting point. Clearly, it will evolve over time, but I think it's a good starting point.
Great, thank you. Saka, same question to you. What should advisors look for at a company or a fund level?
So I think, in addition to what Charles said, which I entirely agree with, I think that there are two things that you have to be comfortable with. One is kind of physician heal thyself. I mean, you have to judge for yourself whether people are being genuine about what they sell you, and that's a judgment call. And it's no different than what an advisor does in judging whether a boutique or a company really is good at whatever subsection of funds they're trying to sell you. And that's to do with getting comfortable with the team, to getting comfortable with the process, to even getting comfortable with the salespeople you contact with. It's about the genuineness of the underlying, and that's just in general. I think when it comes to something which is coming more to the market, and that's what Sarah alluded to, this more bespoke view, the more specific funds, we're going to have sustainability funds come to the market, impact funds are coming to the market, and we have some in the marketplace. You've got to convince yourself then that they really can do this additional thing, because that takes additional skills. So if, when we say we're bringing a whole sustainability suite, that's based on years of being involved in carbon footprinting, being involved in the CFD, being involved in Carbon Tracker, the company that brought up the concept of stranded assets and so on. So look for provenance, for history, in the same way that if people used to invest in me as a global fund manager, they used to look at, where did I learn my process? How did I get my numbers? How can I evidence it? It's just the old skills, but applied with a different lens.
Okay, great, thank you. And finally, Sarah, we're almost out of time, but a final word from you.
Yeah, so at a company or an asset manager level, I would just say continuity is really important. So whether they're managing credit or equity or even real assets for you, make sure there's continuity in the way that they approach it from a philosophical and a cultural level, as the questionnaire at the beginning of this session pointed out. But equally, they're offering you that transparency, the openness, that they're willing to start the dialogue. And from a product level, I would just say, first of all, is it meeting your financial objective as well as your impact objective? As I said, that these two shouldn't be miles apart, that these should be working in cooperation with each other. And also, does the product itself offer everything on the side of a tin, from an impact objective to ESG improvement, to UN SDGs, to decarbonisation? Be careful that things aren't being overly promised on the product that it's offering to deliver, and can it evidence it, going back to Saka's point as well.
Right, well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that we are out of time. I don't know about you, but I found this discussion, the insights from our panelists, absolutely fascinating and extraordinary. We were going to end up with one final poll question, but I'm not going to ask it, because it was, after hearing today's speakers, do you believe ESG and responsible investing are here for the future or a passing fad? And I can't believe it's anything other than here for the future. I'd like to thank Sarah Peasy, Charlie Thomas and Saka Nsebe for their participation today, for being such willing and knowledgeable panelists. It's been fascinating. Good luck, ladies and gentlemen, in what you're doing. We're stepping into a new world in investing. I know it's a world that some of you have occupied for so long. It's fascinating, and I think it's going to be great. Thanks very much, and I'm going to pass back to Nat now for some closing comments.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I completely agree. It's been a really insightful panel there, and what a great morning it has been for our first ESG pathway. And I can only agree that ESG and responsible investing is set to explode further, firmly moving into mainstream investing. So first of all, we heard from the advisors on the panel with Jake on how they have begun integrating and assessing ESG, but also how important it is to look inwardly as as what you're doing as a business to determine a firm approach to ESG before scanning the product universe. Declan, George and Annette also pointed to many useful resources for IFAs. Just to recap, some of the starting points would be the PRI website or the Investment Association framework. They also answered questions on ESG in model portfolios. It's also encouraging to see the poll results showed that 82% of you are integrating responsible investments into CIPs. The advisor panel also explained what they want to see from asset managers in terms of integration, such as independent oversight and ESG running through the core of the business, not just in marketing campaigns, but also that there is continual room for improvement. And the whole industry is on this ESG journey. In our Ask the Expert videos, Malcolm McPartlin at Aegon Asset Management answered the question, is ESG a fad? With the answer being, of course, and I hope we all agree that most definitely not, and is a firm part of our industry's future. The key will be avoiding the losers and backing the winners. AXA investment managers Chris Igo also explained the risks of investing in fossil fuels, including regulatory interventions such as carbon taxes, but also changing consumer demand. And Andrew Parry of Newton Investment Management explained the separate importance of E, S and G. Thank you to Steve at the Lancat. I quite like the name myself, I think it's unique, but Steve gave us 3 key pointers on what ESG investing means in practice, how platforms can help, and that it means different things to different people at different points of the chain, which is a very important point to consider. And lastly, the asset manager panel chaired by Richard that we just seen, Federated Hermes Saka highlighted the importance of stewardship and engagement to generate the best long-term returns and the myths around sacrificing returns. And Elgin Sarah pointed to how COVID-19 has shone a light on the many unsustainable industries and why it's the responsibility of every investment professional to contribute to improving these. It's also interesting to hear how this panel discussed the different approaches to integration between active managers and index providers, how ESG metrics can be applied to different asset classes, and as well as how great groups are using different frameworks such as TCFD. Jupiter's Charlie Thomas echoed the sentiment that ESG investing is evolving and changing all the time, and it really excites me to think about how these conversation panels and the stories that I write will develop over the coming years. So finally, sincere thanks to all of our contributors, speakers, chairs, panelists, everyone behind the scenes at Last Word Media and Square Mile, and of course everyone who has listened in, posted questions and taken part in the polls. We have very much enjoyed making this an interactive experience for you, and we hope that you found it useful. Please don't forget this is a series of webinars, and you can expect more exciting discussion, educational content and presentation around ESG investment solutions for you and your clients in our next session on Wednesday, the 14th of October at the same time, same starting time of 10 a.m. And this session will exploring further how the pandemic has accelerated the demand for responsible investing. And there'll be another opportunity to ask the experts your questions too. Some further dates for your diary as well. The following sessions will be on the 4th of November and 8th of December. So it doesn't look like we are going to get the predicted rain here in Hertfordshire, but so enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you very much for joining us on our first ESG Pathway.